Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on the important financial issues of the day and the way forward by providing a stimulus to this economy, sir. We shall now open the House for interactive session with the dignitaries. Kindly keep the questions brief and to the point. Due to time constraint, our esteemed guests on the dais will not be able to take the questions separately from the members of the press. Therefore, all the question and answer will be restricted to this session only. The session will last around half an hour. Kindly raise your hand for asking the question, and the hostesses will provide you with the mic. Thank you. We may start now.
Hello. 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 So, yeah.
Just raise your hand, sir.
Yes, I'm raising my hand.
Sure.
So you mentioned that the revulsion of blocking movement in Parliament, until the public shows its revulsion, the politicians will not change. How would you like the public to display this revulsion? I mean, what do you want the public to do? Because it's a very important point, and what you said makes a lot of sense. But somewhere the public is not reacting to what's happening. And how do we get this public to galvanize and show this revulsion that blockages of moving forward will not work?
Public opinion has many ways of expressing itself. It's not necessary that you take to the streets. But I think campaigns today, with the kind of facilities available, the media is an important instrument. The social media is a very powerful instrument. Even meeting and questioning those who you think must change also is an important instrument. That's how any civilized debate and opinion making takes place. I don't know.
So I have a complaint. This was meant to be an interactive session, but you have so ruthlessly preempted so many of the questions we were going to ask that I was going to ask about GST, you answered that. I wanted to know why irrigation wasn't going to be a priority to reduce the tyranny of the third FM, as Jayant said. You covered most of them. So I'm left with one question, which in a sense goes into more of the Commerce Ministry's area, but I have no choice but to ask that question. Arundhati mentioned in the beginning that the government has done a great job of creating a growth story, and that's the testament to that is all the number of ministers and representatives of other governments who come in here. They usually come to Delhi, then they come via Bombay, and we get a chance to ask them, what was your impression? And one of the commerce people from a Western country said, we are getting a sense that the government wants us to make in India, but they don't want us to trade with India. And he was saying that there seems to be a huge reluctance to join in any of the trade bodies that are being set up, the trade agreements, whether it's the TPP or the others or even the bilateral treaty. How are we going to address this conundrum? Because they are getting a sense that we are not going to come and make in India unless we get a chance to trade freely.
In trade, you find always a situation where most economies world over also watch their own interests. So the most liberal and developed economies in the world use trade barriers in order to protect, even though on public platforms they always speak in terms of free trade. Now, obviously, the government has been open to trade agreements. There are a large number of BPAs we are a party to. There are a large number of FTAs we are a party to. And you weigh the examples of each one of them. And I must confess that some of your colleagues in the industry come up and say a number of them have started now hurting us. You see, world over, foreign policy and trade policy do not necessarily overlap. But conventionally in India, it had happened particularly during the last government that every time the Prime Minister took a trip abroad, the easiest thing to sign was an FTA with that country. And too many of them are also bringing about the results which are not exactly very favorable to our domestic industry itself. And therefore your colleagues itself come in, therefore the whole idea of being cautious. Europe and the United States have the best of relationship. They litigate with each other over trade issues. So that's not really necessarily overlapping with foreign policy areas. We are for trade transactions and trade deals, but then the countries will always have a local industrial interests also in mind which influence those decisions.
So my question, Arunji, is really on reforms, and more so on legal reforms. And as we talk to global investors and Indian investors, a key question that comes to everybody's mind is why is India going slow on legal reforms? And it's a troika of three different issues. One is the national litigation policy. Second one is the new arbitration law that you alluded to. And the third one is the new bankruptcy law. Of course, there is SARFAESI, which is tabled in Parliament, etc. But considering the gridlock that we have in Parliament, how soon can we really expect to see progress on these three issues? Because that is really clouding, I would say, potential new investment both from global and foreign investors.
You see, there is one is the three specific areas that you mentioned. The litigation policy is more or less ready. We had a small group of, informal group of ministers which has cleared it, and therefore there is no issue. The bankruptcy code was to be ready by the end of July. I think it's going to be ready any of these days. The arbitration law has already been cleared by the cabinet, and it's being introduced in Parliament as soon as the Parliament starts functioning. So all the three are ready. But in India, when legal reforms are involved, it's not merely between the litigant and the industry on one hand and the government on the other. There's a third agency, which is the courts. And therefore, courts not being a part of the legislative process are only interpreters of that legislative decisions. Now, what went wrong with the arbitration law? The original arbitration law was based on the UNCITRAL model law which countries world over had accepted. We also accepted that. Now, countries all over the world said no judicial interference. The Indian Supreme Court said no, there will be judicial interference. So at every state in arbitration, the courts would intervene. Now, the result of this was disastrous. The result was that every time you entered into a collaboration or a joint venture with somebody, they would always insist on a foreign jurisdiction, a foreign substantive law, and a foreign procedural law. I am yet to come across important international joint ventures where people agreed India to be the venue and Indian courts having the authority, Indian procedural laws applying. So they started ousting laws. And as far as the Indian counterpart in that joint venture was concerned, you found those forums somewhat tilted against you. You found those forums almost unaffordable. Even the leaders of Indian industry found those extremely costly as tribunals. Therefore, the interpretation given by the Indian courts that irrespective of the legislation, the ancestral model law, we will have a right to interfere, actually created an adversity for us. Now, you mentioned Sarfazi just now. We had to go through hell to have the Sarfazi law cleared by the Supreme Court. They put in certain safeguards into it. They found the old regime where the creditor must indefinitely keep chasing the debtor to be more acceptable. Now, even in the national litigation policy, where you say that the case must be decided within such and such time, almost every area of law which has a time limit fixed to it, when it comes to the executive, the courts hold it to be binding. When the time limit applies to the courts, they hold it to be directory and not mandatory. I remember as a law minister, I put a time limit in the Civil Procedure Code, and all those time limits have been dismantled by saying, no, they are only directory, they are not mandatory. Legislature can't tell us how much time we have to decide a case. Therefore, the problem in India will always have to be realized that the implementer of those reforms has to accept the culture of those reforms.
So, assuming that there will be a time limit on arbitration, or there will be a time limit?
You see, the new amendment to the Arbitration Act has put a time limit. The ordinary time limit, the normal time limit is 18 months and no more. But there is a separate chapter which provides for a fast-track arbitration. And the chapter which provides for a fast-track arbitration says the parties can choose to go under the fast-track arbitration in which both parties will agree that that arbitration has to get over in 6 months. So the fast-track arbitration is a 6-month arbitration.
Now we'll
Gently, may
take
I ask
one
you a
more question.
One question may I ask? Thank you for a brilliant speech. I'll ask you a question on the question of constitution. You have pointed out that the central government, in view of its mandate, passing many important laws by parliament, but they're getting stalled by Union of States in the Rajya Sabha. Don't you think that in a way dilutes our federal structure? Because the union government's power to make laws and getting it passed through parliament, and some of which have to go to Council of States. In a way, does it not, in a way, sort of...
But let me come precisely. I'm glad you asked that question. This is Justice Ganguly, formerly judge of the Supreme Court. You see, in the case in which the controversy has taken place, 100% of the states have said we want the GST. The central government has said we want the GST.
How does it get stalled?
The House of the People says we want the GST. Therefore, it's not the states which are holding it up. It's not the directly elected House which is holding it up. It's the politics of obstructionism which is holding it up. So that precisely points out to what I've been suggesting. And therefore, in the Indian context, in the present case, I can quite understand the Council of States represents the will of the states as far as the center is concerned and its role in the governance of the center. It's different from the House of Lords example which I gave because that's a nominated house. Yes. Here it's elected by the states. But when the states themselves are saying that we want this legislation, can you by merely shouting down the proceedings obstruct that legislation? That's the point I was trying to make.
Therefore, it's an unconstitutional process in a way.
I would still call it obstructionism rather than.
And one more question. In line of the kind of amendments you are thinking in laws, are you thinking in terms of setting up commercial courts?
Well,
That is very important in my
you see,
opinion.
the institution of commercial courts, now, this again goes back to the point I made. How frequently can you start questioning otherwise decisions which are taken? The idea of commercial courts came from the Law Commission. Accepting the decision of the Law Commission, the previous government introduced a bill for setting up commercial courts in every high court of the country. And commercial courts would have jurisdiction with regard to matters which can otherwise not go to the subordinate courts. So you have an international commercial arbitration, you have a patent law dispute, you have joint ventures between global majors which can't go to city civil courts. Every high court would have one bench of the commercial court, or it will be called the commercial division of the high court. Now there were some difficulties in that law because that law provided erroneously for every case to be decided by a division bench of 2 judges, which is normally commercial cases are decided by a single judge. So it got referred to a committee, the committee gave its report. Now that law has come back. That law is also before the select committee of Rajya Sabha. And therefore, it was otherwise on schedule. They've now asked for time, I think, till the 31st of August. But it was otherwise on schedule to be introduced in this session of Parliament and preferably passed in this session of Parliament. So that law is ready. It was drafted by the previous government, improved upon by this government, and the law is absolutely ready.
Thank you very much, sir, and all the guests present in the gathering for the most lively and interactive session. I'll request Shri P. Pradeep Kumar, Managing Director, Corporate Banking, State Bank of India, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, Honorable Union Minister for Finance, Mr. Shri Arun Jaitley ji, Honorable Minister for State for Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha ji, Dr. Hasmukh Adhia, Secretary DFS, distinguished guests, doyens of industries, fellow bankers, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be called upon to propose a vote of thanks on the occasion of the inauguration of the second State Bank of India Banking and Economic Conclave, our annual flagship event. The government's reforms drive have led most global institutions such as IMF, Moody's and World Bank to lift their economic growth outlook for the country. India's economy is poised to grow over 7% this year, helped by lower interest rates that we believe will spur in a private sector investment. India's economy is on a cyclical upswing and forward-looking indicators suggest domestic demand is gathering momentum. We are extremely grateful to the Honorable Union Minister of Finance, Shri Arun Jaitley ji, for being with us on this occasion and sharing his views on the economy and the need to exploit the global situation to our advantage. He also shared with us the government's commitment to growth through reforms despite political obstruction. We are also grateful to Honorable Minister of State for Finance, Shri Jayant Sinha ji, for his presence and words of encouragement. And I am sure that India will seize this moment and grow at rates above 9%. I would also like to thank Shri Dr. Hasmukh Adhia, Secretary, Department of Financial Services, for his unstinted support and guidance. I would also like to thank all our distinguished guests, doyens of industries, officials of the Government of India, our friends from the banking fraternity for their presence and participation in this inaugural function. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the members of the media for their interest in covering the event. Honorable Union Minister of Finance, Honorable Minister of State for Finance, Secretary DFS, ladies and gentlemen, once again I want to state that we at SBI are most grateful to you for gracing the occasion. On behalf of the bank, I thank you for being with us this evening. It's been a great pleasure for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kindly join us for dinner.